Hello, today I want to talk about a very important topic, namely the decline in educational achievement of males. And in particular, I want to talk about how self-proclaimed expert Richard Reeves talks about this subject, because I think he spreads a lot of falsehoods about this topic, as we shall see in this video, right? Called Male Inequality Explained by an Expert, Richard Reeves. And I will not go through this whole video, I will just cover the information he gives about the male educational decline, which I think he covers very poorly, right? And just to give you some background on Richard Reeves, he is a British author and writer and scholar and senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. And it also says here, until 2012, Reeves was Director of Strategy to Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg. Previously, he had been Director of the London-based think tank Demos. Reeves has held positions including Director of Futures at the Work Foundation, a British non-profit organization, Society Editor of The Observer, Economics Correspondent and Washington Correspondent of The Guardian, and Policy Advisor to Frank Field when he was Minister for Welfare Reform. As you can see, a well-connected, kind of liberal establishment guy who has worked for The Guardian, which is a very feminist media outlet, right? So this liberal clown, and who has feminist bias, as we shall see, wants to talk now as if he cares about men's issues and men's disadvantages, right? And especially in particular, the decline in achievement of boys in the education system, right? So let's hear what kind of explanation he gives and what kind of solution he offers.
In college degrees. So the gender inequality we see in college today is wider than it was 50 years ago. It's just the other way around. There's quite a fierce debate about the differences between male and female brains.
So he immediately goes to male and female biological differences as his go-to explanation, right, for the gender gap in education.
In adulthood, I think there's not much evidence that the brains are that different in ways that we should worry about or that are particularly consequential. But where there's no real debate is in the timing of brain development. It is quite clear that girls' brains develop more quickly than boys' brains do, and that the biggest difference seems to occur in adolescence. So what happens is in adolescence, we develop what neuroscientists call the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex of our brain is sometimes known as the CEO of the brain. It's the bit of your brain that says you should do your chemistry homework rather than going out to party. It's the bit of your brain that says it is worth maintaining a high GPA because it will help you get to college, which might help you in the future. And that bit of the brain develops considerably earlier in girls than in boys, between 1 and 2 years earlier, partly because girls go into puberty a bit earlier than boys, and that seems to trigger some of this development. What that means is that if you have an education system that rewards the ability to turn in homework, stay on task, worry about your GPA, prepare for college and so on, then just structurally, that's going to put at an advantage the group whose brains have developed earlier in those particular areas. And that turns out on average to be girls. I think it's a great irony.
So this is his main argument, his main go-to reason as to why boys are at a disadvantage in schools, and this has a ripple effect, according to him, also structurally throughout the educational and academic career of men. Okay, so let's hear the rest and then we will counter this narrative.
Of women's progress, that by taking the brakes off women's educational opportunities and aspirations, we've revealed the fact that the education system is slightly structured against boys and men because of these differences in the timing of brain development. But it took the women's movement to show that, because the natural advantages of women in education were impossible to see when women's aspirations were being capped by a sexist society.
That is a lie. That is a total lie. And he even says that women have a natural advantage in the education system. So they're like, so he wants to say basically they're like better than males inherently in the education system, right? So this is very interesting, and we'll look actually what the real reason is why boys are falling behind. They're actually being held back, as we shall see, right? And he makes this baseless claim that women's education was suppressed or some bullshit like that.
Now that those caps have been largely removed, we can see that it's boys and men who are at a disadvantage in the education system. At the risk of sounding boring, let's collect the data first so we know what we're dealing with here. I do think that we should be strongly encouraging boys to start school a year later than girls. I think that should become the default in many school districts because of the developmental gap that there is between boys and girls. Because boys' brains mature more slowly, then them starting school a year later would mean that they were developmentally closer to being peers with the girls in the classroom.
The whole redshirting, the whole academic redshirting of boys is very controversial actually, and there are also studies that show negative effects of that, but we will get to that.
Need a lot more male teachers. It's striking that the teaching profession has become steadily more female over time. Only 24% of K-12 teachers now are male. That's down from 33% in the 80s. And fewer men are applying to teacher training year on year. And
yeah, why is this though? Will you explain why this is actually happening? Or what contributes to that? Or is it just out of nowhere that there are way less male teachers than there are female teachers? Will you actually talk about that? Because I'm going to talk about that, but you're not.
We've seen this steady shift towards a close to an all-female environment. That has all kinds of consequences for the ethos of the school, for the way we deal with different kinds of behavior among boys and girls, for example. And so we need a very serious and intentional effort to get more men into teaching. The third thing I would do in this world where I have significant power to dictate policies would be significantly more investment in vocational education and training. That is an area where we do seem to see better results for boys and men on average, and one that's woefully underinvested in the US. The US has really bet most of its dollars on a very academic, a very narrow route towards success, and less emphasis on vocational training. And that has actually put boys and men at a disadvantage. So apprenticeships, technical high schools, are actually a really good way to help more boys and men.
Yeah, okay. The last thing I think is the last proposition that he makes about vocational training and investing more in that is not necessarily a bad thing, I think. But you can have your own views about that. Now, let's actually look at what is the actual reason why boys and men are falling behind in the education system, in the school system, because he only talked about brain development. He never mentioned anything else, any other factor actually. And to show you that this is actually what he does regularly, he wrote an article in the Atlantic, right? Redshirt the boys, why boys should start school a year later than girls, by Richard Reeves. And it says right here, the basic trend is clear at every age on almost every educational metric across the world. Girls are leaving boys in the dust. Among many of the parents I know, a shorthand explanation has developed to explain the struggles of an adolescent child to stay on track, especially academically. He's a boy. What's going on here? There are many potential explanations. The feminization of the teaching profession, 3 out of 4 K-12 teachers are now women, is not ideal for boys. I wonder why that is, but we'll talk about that later. Neither is the rigid rhythm of the school day, with gym class and recess squeezed out, and the focus on narrow academics rather than vocational learning puts many boys at a disadvantage as well. All true and all worth addressing. And now he says, but I believe the biggest reason for boys' classroom struggles is simply that male brains develop more slowly than female brains. So, as you can see, this is something that he regularly pushes as the main explanation and the biggest explanation, right? Which basically amounts to victim blaming and biological essentialism, right? Let's actually look at something more accurate. It is a myth that boys lag behind in brain development. It is true that girls perform better at school than boys, but this is not due to differences in brain development. This is the conclusion psychobiologist Lara Vierenga draws from a recent study, publication in the Journal of Cognitive Neuroscience. It is the first study that directly links brain development to gender differences and school performance. With this research, we disprove the neurological myth that boys are lagging behind in brain development. If teachers and parents become aware of this, we hope this will lead to more equal opportunities for individuals rather than accepting the misconception that it is all down to a boy's or girl's brain, says psychobiologist Vierenga. Fact-checking. Vierenga points to a widespread misunderstanding in the popular media that boys' brains lag behind developmentally compared to girls. This is often taken to explain why girls perform better at school. Vierenga, in this study, we discovered that brain development in boys and girls is very similar. Are the differences in school performance between boys and girls perhaps reflected in the structure of their brains? The researchers wanted to know. They found no scientific evidence of this either. We don't know where the differences in school performance come from, but it isn't due to a difference in brain development between boys and girls. The rate at which parts of the brain develop does show more variation between boys than between girls. There are more boys with delayed or accelerated brain development than girls. Researching brain development. To discover whether boys lag behind in brain development compared to girls, the researchers tested 217 boys and girls between 8 and 29 years old. They followed them for 5 years and examined the structure of their brains several times with an MRI scanner. The participants also performed tasks from various school subjects, including a reading task and a task testing numerical memory. This did indeed show that there are often differences in school performance between boys and girls. Right, but these performances are not due to brain development, as Richard Reeves claims. So, what is the actual reason why boys lag behind girls in school, right? And as we shall see, this has something to do with bias against boys and men, and discrimination against boys and men in the education system, and also with feminism, also with fatherlessness, which negatively impact especially young boys, right? But yeah, before we get to these things and the evidence connected to that, we will look at what Richard Reeves has said as a solution, right? The whole red shirting thing, right? Research suggests red shirting may be harmful. A recent New Yorker article compiled much of the research on children who began school a year late, and it is not a pretty picture. A study of Norwegian children born between 1962 and 1988 found that the children who began school late had lower IQs and lower earnings than their on time classmates. A study of all Swedish children born between 1935 and 1984 showed lower lifetime earnings for those who started school later. The 2008 Harvard study argued that more students might not graduate because they could quit school before finishing, and more students would have lower lifetime earnings as a result of entering the workforce a year late. A 2007 analysis of the data from a Tennessee research study known as Project STAR revealed that older kindergartners had no edge over their younger classmates and, in fact, scored lower on achievement exams in kindergarten and middle school and were more likely to have been held back by middle school and were less likely to take college entrance exams. Meanwhile, younger students actually lapped their older peers, demonstrating higher academic achievement. So yeah, this research indicates that this solution that Richard Reeves proposed, the red shirting and boys starting a year later in school, could actually be detrimental, right? I mean, this is controversial. There are also studies that show some positive effects and what have you, right? But I think that given that this is not very clear and there are studies that showing these negative correlations, that I would not say that this is like the end all be all solution for boys who lag behind in school, right? So let's actually look at the real reasons why boys lag behind in school and why men and boys lag behind in school, because they are being held back actually. So here's a study called Do Gender Stereotypes Reduce Girls' Human Capital Outcomes? Evidence from a Natural Experiment. Schools and teachers are often said to be a source of stereotypes that harm girls. This paper tests for existence of gender stereotyping and discrimination by public high school teachers in Israel. It uses a natural experiment based on blind and non-blind scores that students receive on matriculation exams in their senior year. Using data on test subjects results in several subjects in the humanities and sciences, I found, contrary to expectations, that male students face discrimination in each subject. These biases widen the female-male achievement gap because girls outperform boys in all subjects except English and at all levels of the curriculum. The bias is evident in all segments of the ability and performance distribution and is robust to various individual controls. Several explanations based on differential behavior between boys and girls are not supported empirically. However, the size of the bias is very sensitive to teachers' characteristics, suggesting that the bias against male students is the result of teachers and not students' behavior. So this is one experimental study that shows that it is teachers' gender bias that places male students at a disadvantage and that male students are discriminated against in all subjects. Okay? And this is just one example. What about more examples? Right? How boys lag behind, how teachers' gender biases affect student achievement. I use a combination of blind and non-blind test scores to show that middle school teachers favor girls in their evaluations. This favoritism, estimated as individual teacher effects, has long-term consequences, as measured by their national evaluations. 3 years later, male students make less progress than their female counterparts. On the other hand, girls who benefit from gender bias in math are more likely to select a science track in high school. Without teachers' bias in favor of girls, the gender gap in choosing a science track would be 12.5% larger in favor of boys. So, as you can see, teachers' gender bias in favor of girls contributes to this gender gap, right? And here's even more evidence. A helping hand for girls, gender bias in marks and its effect on student progress. Analysis of marks given both anonymously and not to students in the first year of junior high school reveals positive discrimination for girls in math, but an absence of gender bias in French. For similar anonymous marks, girls receive higher marks from their math teachers than boys. The less disruptive behavior of girls in class does not seem to explain this helping hand. So as you can see, this cannot be blamed on boys' behavior, right? Because there's the stereotype that boys behave less good in class, right? That they are more disruptive, and this is not the reason why they receive worse marks or grades than girls, right? And what also needs to be said is that corporal punishment in US schools is still legal in 19 states. And you can already guess that the boys actually bear the brunt of this corporal punishment, right? These results are consistent with previous analyses of within-state use of corporal punishment. In the early 1990s, a review of several thousand cases in Florida found that 82% of students who received corporal punishment were male. A review of school corporal punishment in North Carolina found the same results 20 years later. 83% of those receiving corporal punishment were boys. Boys account for roughly 50% of the student population in both states. Differences in rates of misbehavior can explain some, but not all, of the differences in corporal punishment administered to boys versus girls. Although boys have been found to be twice as likely as girls to be referred to school office for discipline for a range of misbehaviors, they are not twice as likely to be corporally punished, but rather 4 times as likely. It is clear that boys are grossly overrepresented among students who receive corporal punishment. So, yeah, boys bear the brunt of corporal punishment in schools. And what kind of effect does this have? Well, According to this study titled Gender Differences in Corporal Punishment, Academic Self-Efficiency and Dropout in Secondary School Students, the findings of the study revealed that corporal punishment showed a positive relationship with dropout. Boys were found to expose more to corporal punishment and had higher dropout than the girls. Moreover, girls were higher in academic self-efficiency than the boys. So as you can see, this corporal punishment has detrimental effects for the boys. Their school life is disrupted by it, right? They have higher dropout rates. This is detrimental for their academic careers. Or here's more evidence. Boys bear the brunt of school discipline. Early behavioral problems more negatively impact high school and college completion rates for boys than girls. The idea was to explain why college completion rates have surged among women, but she soon came to realize that the flip side of the coin was perhaps even more revealing, that education achievement levels have actually declined for men. One of the big things that jumped out in the study was the fact that same behavioral problems in boys and girls were penalized a lot more in boys than girls, Owen says. So in addition to the fact that boys come to school on average having more problems, they also get penalized more for having these behaviors. Among other finding, for example, the study showed that in elementary school, boys on average report significantly greater exposure to negative school environments and peer pressure compared to girls. And in high school, they report significantly higher rates of grade repetition and lower educational expectations. So the same behavior that boys and girls have, boys receive more punishment. This shows you that the education system is extremely biased against boys. They get more corporal punishment, they get more discipline for the same behavior. They get worse grades because of teachers' gender bias, right? And what I also want to show is, for example, this study finds more than half of colleges facially violates Title IX with women-only scholarships, right? A review of more than 200 American colleges and universities revealed that they favor women over men by a wide margin in sex-specific scholarships. So there's a whole range of scholarships for women, right? And when you see the campuses, the college campuses have rampant anti-male propaganda and anti-male fear-mongering, right? The face of anti-male bias in academia, a compilation of banners, posters, and other visuals, right? So here you see student groups with a sign that says castrate, right? In Duke University, see fear-mongering, right? That when both students drink, only the female student could not consent, but what about the male student? So they vilifying the male on this poster, right? And also here more fear-mongering and propaganda that all males are rapists. And here's another thing from UCLA. Do tip if you offer someone a ride, remember not to rape them. Right? And this professor, or this presentation says she fears you, right? So there's anti-male feminist propaganda all over in academia. There's lots of examples here. Here's what students have been wearing as t-shirts. This t-shirt that says boys are stupid, throw rocks at them. Very hateful anti-male propaganda on college campuses, right? This is also a huge problem. And also what I think needs to be considered here is the effect of fatherlessness on the educational achievement of men and boys, right? And what contributes to that is the feminist influence over the legal system, education system. That is actually the driving main influence for why there's a crisis. And one of the examples I can give you is the opposing shared parenting, the feminist track record throughout many years. Feminists have opposed the shared parenting, especially the National Organization for Women, which is the most powerful organization, feminist organization in the United States of America, right? But we see similar trends in Europe as well, right? For example, it says here, women's groups who boycotted nationwide government consultations on changes to divorce law because they refused to sit at the same table as men could get female-only hearing they have demanded. Although the consultations ended last month, the Justice Department and its provincial partners have considering a special season for women's equality seeking organizations that are fighting proposed changes to the Federal Divorce Act. Those changes would give separated and divorced partners an equal say in raising their children under a new concept called shared parenting. The women's groups are urging governments, quote, not to cave into a father's rights group's agenda, end quote. And in 2005, the National Organization for Women stated their reasons for opposing shared parenting. Quote, shared parenting is defined as the award of custody to both parties so that both parties share equally the legal responsibility and control of such child and share equally the living experience in time and physical care of assure frequent and continuing contact with both parties as the court deems to be in the best interest of the child, taking into consideration the location and circumstances of each party. The assertion that shared parenting is in the best interest of minor children is on its face untrue. The following facts continue to be true with respect to mandatory joint custody of children. To arbitrarily reassign a child's primary caregiver or disrupt a child's attachment to a primary caregiver creates an unstable, even traumatic situation for the children. Increased father involvement does not necessarily result in positive outcomes for children, end quote. So there you have it. The feminist organization now said that father's involvement is not necessarily positive and is not needed. And again, this feminist organization has much power and actually vetoed a shared parenting bill. I think it was in Florida, right? Even though research showed that shared parenting is actually very good and very beneficial for children, especially for boys, as we shall see. Here's this text meta-study on shared parenting. Dr. Linda Nielsen, Wake Forest University professor, reviewed 60 studies that have compared children in these two types of families during the past 25 years and found that shared parenting is best for children in separated and divorced families. Kids who share time between both parents' homes approximately equally have better outcomes related to academic achievement, drugs, alcohol, and cigarette use, mental and physical health, less early sexual activity and teen pregnancy, higher employment and earnings later in life, greater likelihood of family stability in their own adulthoods, better relationships with parents, step-parents, and grandparents. So there you go, especially academic achievement, because this is the topic at hand, right? So feminists, by opposing shared parenting, have contributed to academic achievement of children, and that includes boys, to go downhill, okay? And this is, again, emphasized here. Report reveals national crisis of fatherlessness linked to higher crime rates, poverty, and school failure. Active, engaged dads in the home improve the chances of future generations of men graduating college, finding gainful employment, and staying out of prison. That's the conclusion from the Institute for Family Studies, whose research estimates 12 million boys are growing up in families without their biological father. Even after adjusting for other factors, the data showed how boys growing up without their father are half as likely to graduate from college compared to their peers from intact families. So there you have it. A crisis is emerging, and that is connected to fatherlessness, right? So feminists who have worked to keep the father out of the home have contributed to boys' underachievement in the education system. Very apparent. And also you can see single mother homes not so beneficial for boys. For example, bullied girls, but not boys, benefit from mom's support. Children who are bullied become tolerant of aggressive and antisocial behavior, such as cheating, lying, or being cruel to others. But can a mother's affection and communication with the child prevent negative behavioral outcomes for the bullied child? Researchers say yes for girls, but no for boys. In a newly published study involving more than 1,000 children older than 8 years. So, in mother-only homes, single mother homes, the boys are not adequately supported when they are bullied, and this leads to antisocial behavioral patterns and all kinds of social problems, which of course is also detrimental to their academic career and educational achievement, right? So keeping fathers out of the home, opposing shared parenting, has these negative ripple effects. And again, what contributes to fatherlessness, for example, divorce, right? And when there's divorce, mothers gain 90% of, or 90 to 80% of the custody, right? In most cases, they gain the custody. And why is that? That has something to do, for example, with parental alienation. And, well, feminists have a track record denying the existence of parental alienation because most of the time it's the mother's alienating, is the alienating parent, right? And it says right here, in their own publications, parental alienation critics ignore the vast scientific literature that affirms parental alienation and its acceptance in the scientific and legal worlds. Furthermore, they flippantly dismiss parental alienation as a discredited theory that is not accepted by the scientific community, and thereby mislead uninformed readers. For example, the National Organization for Women, there it is again, published a list of their accomplishments on their website. Among the entries is the following, quote, 2012, April, now Foundation sends letter to American Psychiatric Association objecting to inclusion in the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual 5, DSM-5, of a phony psychological syndrome, parental alienation syndrome. This so-called psychiatric condition is being used in child custody cases to remove custody from protective parents, usually mothers, and often awarding custody to an abusive parent, usually fathers. DSM-5 does not include parental alienation as a recognized psychological condition, end quote. This is not science, this is science fiction. Some parental alienation critics are also proactive in promoting legislation to discredit parental alienation. So the feminist lobby groups, such as the National Organization for Women, are working hard to hide the fact that parental alienation is going on, right? Which is in divorce cases and child custody cases a factor that rips the child away from their father, right? And to show evidence that female parents are the most likely alienating parent. Here's a study, Parental Alienation in U.S. Courts from 1985 to 2018. And here you can see a graph that shows you that the number of parental alienation cases is increasing during decades from the 80s to the 2000s and 2015, right? Steadily increasing. And this graph shows you that the majority of the alienating parents during all this time were the mothers, were the female parent, right? Like 75% or so, right? You can see it in this graph. You can read the study yourself, right? And you can see also in this graph that this had an impact in the percentage in which child custody changed, right? And it is always very high. It actually very rarely drops under the 30% range. It is usually very high, the impact rate, so to speak. And why is that? Because the divorce courts have gender stereotypes, are biased against men, biased against fathers. As we can see in this study, gender stereotypes underlie child custody decisions. Using hypothetical divorce cases, we examine the role of gender stereotypes in decisions about child custody. Good mothers received greater custody allocations than did good fathers across a tightly matched pair of vignettes in three culturally distinct samples, Argentina, Brazil, and the United States. Two follow-up studies indicated that the warmth dimension of stereotype content partly accounted for the asymmetry in custody awards. The proportion of maternal primary custody was predicted by the tendency to ascribe warmth-related traits such as friendliness, generosity, or trustworthiness to mothers, and associate them to female over male nouns. So this is just one example of the divorce courts being biased in favor of mothers and having these gender stereotypes, which is why many men feel hopeless during divorce cases, and which is why the mothers often get the custody more, and the kids are ending up in single mother households, which again is especially detrimental to the boy's upbringing and the boy's education subsequently. And now we will also want to talk about teachers, right? Because Richard Reeves, he has rightly pointed out that there are less male teachers than female teachers in the education system, but he has not talked about why this is, right? And one of the reasons is that male teachers are facing gender bias and discrimination. It says right here, men are less likely to become elementary teachers or nurses because of gender bias, report finds. Men are much less likely to get jobs in hospitality fields like teaching and nursing. Discrimination and bullying they face because of their gender keeps them away. Rates of men in these types of fields has not grown since the late 1990s. Male early elementary teachers have reported higher rates of discrimination and are perceived as less likable, less hireable, and a greater safety threat to children than female teachers. Right? So negative stereotypes, bullying from female teachers keeps the men away from the teaching profession. This is something that Richard Reeves should have mentioned, and here's more evidence for that. Addressing the lack of male elementary school teachers, factors that influence grade level preference. Contributing factors discrimination. Zeringo and Baldwin Leclerc were clearly pointing out that a male teacher in elementary education might face discrimination from teachers, parents, and even students. For decades, elementary schools had been disproportionately populated by female teachers. Zeringo and Baldwin Leclerc suggested discrimination against male teachers stems from disproportionately female population, and that female teachers might not always feel that male teachers were nurturing enough or that they were as qualified as females. Often gender discrimination could actually prevent a male from fulfilling his job description. So, as you can see, the female teachers, female staff in schools have negative perceptions and are of male teachers and are using their social position and their social dominance to make the male teachers face discrimination and to keep them from entering these fields, right? And there's also another thing, and there's also another thing about female teachers. They give boys lower grades or lower marks, right? A key reason why boys lag behind in the classroom is revealed for the first time today: female teachers. Groundbreaking research shows that boys lower their sights if they think their work is going to be marked by a woman because they believe their results will be worse. It also shows their suspicions are correct. Female teachers did on average, award lower marks to boys than unidentified external examiners. Male teachers, by contrast, awarded them higher marks than external examiners. The findings published by the Center for Economic Performance today could have immense repercussions for boys because of the dearth of male teachers in the profession. Only 15% of primary school staff are men. So, as you can see, female teachers are extreme biased against boys, and they downgrade them, they downmark them on purpose, out of spite, out of hostility, out of bias. And this is something that Richard Reeves has not clearly addressed, right? And he has also not addressed why there are less male teachers, right? And here's also OECD evidence, because someone might be saying that there are differences in learning habits and among girls and boys, for example, right? And this might be the reason that they have different in educational outcome. But it says right here, girls are more likely to receive better marks than boys in most countries and economies, even when they have similar reading, performance, and learning habits. So there you go. Learning habits cannot be the reason why girls receive higher marks than boys. Right? And we also need to look a little bit on, we also need to look a little bit into the history when it comes to the education system. Here's an old New York Times article from 1989 that highlighted a landmark case when it comes to SAT scores, right? It says U.S. court says awards based on SATs are unfair to girls, right? So what this basically highlights here is that the feminist lobby have said that SAT tests, which boys have at that time have performed better in than girls, and based on these SAT tests, they have been awarded scholarships. But they said, no, this is unfair, right? And since then, the scholarship for boys has dropped. So it says right here, New York State's method of awarding merit scholarships to high school students on the basis of their scores on scholastic aptitude tests discriminate against girls, a federal judge in Manhattan ruled yesterday. He ordered the state to change its selection process. For reasons that experts have not fully explained, boys consistently outscore girls on the widely used tests, and the performance gap between the two sexes has been growing every year. So, in the 80s and 90s, when this was going on, they had these meritocratic test scores, and boys were outperforming the girls there. But then all of a sudden it says, then all of a sudden they say, "Oh no, this is discrimination. We need to abolish these tests and the rewards for the boys in terms of scholarship." And of course, you can see here it is the feminists who have lobbied for that, right? Isabel Katz Pinsler, the director of the American Civil Liberties Union Women's Rights Project, and the lead attorney for the case said her organization would now consider legal challenges to other uses of the tests. It's really a very important precedent-setting case, she told the Associated Press. Quote, it's really not fair to anybody to give a scholarship based on a 3-hour test given on a Saturday afternoon rather than 4 years of high school, end quote. And that was the main problem for the feminists, right? If it was the other way around, that girls outperform boys in these tests, they would think, they would say that the SATs are totally fine and that this is not worth making a fuss about. And of course, the lawsuit also was filed by the National Organization for Women yet again, right? And also the Girls Clubs of America. So yeah, you can see that historically, if there was a scholarship award for boys more than for girls, then the feminists have done their best to abolish that and take that away from boys. And I think it's also very important to talk about this subject, the Title IX abuse that is going on college campus, right? Because female students can just anonymously accuse male students of sexual misconduct, right? And there's no due process on these campuses for the male students, and that is also ruining their academic career. Let us have a listen to this.
Marked the 50th anniversary of a very important and not well understood law that is called Title IX. So you may have heard of it. If so, you probably know it as the law that requires sex and gender-based equality in public education. Its original purpose, going back to the 1970s, the time of its adoption, was to ensure that no woman was denied a spot in a school, the right to start a club, participate in a sport because of her sex. It's important, well-intended law. Women did face rampant sexism in all sectors of society, and education was no different. Now, how well the law actually fared in achieving equality, I think, is up for debate. My colleague at Reason Magazine, Natalie Dowzicki, wrote that Title IX did remove barriers for women and girls to participate in sports, but the implementation has been flawed with worse outcomes than anticipated. Now, obviously, the transgender sports debate is directly related to Title IX, and Rising Friday's host Emily Jashinsky talked about some of that in her radar on Friday. But I want to talk about a different aspect of Title IX, a curious one that dates back to actually just the Obama administration, a little more than a decade ago. The Education Department did something I think was truly bizarre. The administration's Education Department interpreted Title IX, this gender equality statute, as requiring university administrators to treat sexual misconduct and harassment as forms of sex-based discrimination and investigate all accusations on college campuses frequently with a zealousness that often sacrificed principles of basic fairness. Under Catherine Lehman, who was the Obama administration's Title IX enforcer, colleges increasingly moved to a single investigator model in which one administrator would investigate a claim of sexual misconduct, determine which witnesses to interview, and produce a report asserting guilt or innocence. Accused students were routinely denied access to legal counsel, awareness of the charges against them, and the ability to cross-examine their accusers and their witnesses. Hundreds of students, most of them men, not all of them, but most of them, were sanctioned by an educational institution attempting to comply with the Obama administration's interpretation of Title IX. These sanctions were frequently challenged in court, and then many such students ultimately prevailed due to the underlying unfairness and the quasi-legality of these Kafkaesque proceedings. For many, however, relief comes far too late to resuscitate their college careers. Quote, Title IX is supposed to ensure fairness for...
So, as you can see, the male students getting basically punished and having to face legal terrorism. This is what it is, this abuse of the Title IX laws. They cannot cross-examine their accusers. They don't have the legal counseling. They just get accused out of the blue and have to face the consequences, and their academic career is in shambles for it. This is what's going on the campuses, right? I wonder why Richard Reeves never talked about this, right? And just to show you, for example, on this article, the Biden administration is unwilling to oppose discrimination against men, right? And it says right here, the overwhelming majority of those sanctioned in schools under Title IX rules are male, and the majority of Title IX administrators are women. The federal government is only widening these gender disparities. The United States Department of Education cited with female complainants 24 times as often as with male complainants between 2012 and 2019. So these feminists are state-backed, right? Title IX administrators are mostly women, and those are punished are mostly men without due process, right? So has this something to do with brain development, Richard Reeves? Why there is this anti-male, misandric, systemic discrimination going on in the education system? Richard Reeves? Why do you not talk about this? And also, last but not least, here's also good evidence that feminists are really behind this, right? This is from the Telegraph. Boys left to fail at school because attempts to help them earn wrath of feminists, says ex-UCAS chief. Britain's education system is failing to tackle the astonishing underperformance of boys, as feminists have made the topic taboo, the former head of the University Admissions Service has warned. Mary Cornuck Cook, who was chief executive of UCAS until last year, said the fact that boys are falling behind in education is a national scandal, yet it is as such an unfashionable topic to discuss that it has become normalized. Girls outperform boys in all parts of education, from primary school to GCSEs and A-level results. Last year, 57% of women went to university compared to 43% of men, a gap that has widened significantly over the last decade. I just find it unacceptable to think that it's okay to let boys fall further and further behind in education and allow the gap to get bigger, Ms. Cornuck Cook said. Boys underachieving in education is becoming pretty normalized. Everyone knows it, yet no one is doing anything about it. She said that other disparities in education, such as the gulf between rich and poor children, are narrowing, but the gap between boys and girls is getting wider. So it has nothing to do with status. It has nothing to do with class differences. It has nothing to do with wealth that this is going on. It has everything to do with gender discrimination against boys, and feminists contribute to that, and they contribute to the systemic problems and discrimination that men and boys face in the legal and education system. And it also says here, Ms. Cornuck Cook said that the debate about gender equality tends to be dominated by issues such as the gender pay gap and the glass ceiling, which are both bullshit issues, by the way. But those are work issues, not education issues, she said. Quite often, initiatives to support men do meet derision from feminists. When attempts are made to address men's issues, they are ridiculed and are met with the wrath of feminists and gender equality groups, she said. So there you have it. This is really all the evidence that you need. Feminists are behind the decline in the education system of boys and men. Not brain development, Richard Reeves. Okay? This is all about discrimination of boys and men in the education system. Anti-male discrimination, misandry, also coming from feminists and female teachers. Okay? And to show you that this guy, Richard Reeves, is a feminist, right? Here's an interview he had on the website Political Discourse titled Can Fatherhood Cure the Modern Male Malaise, right? A conversation with Richard Reeves. And he said this about traditional families, right? Richard Reeves says about traditional families were massively economically unequal and to some extent predicated on a division of economic power, which in my view was to the detriment of women. End quote. So, yeah, this is complete bullshit. It was traditional families are not to the detriment of women. Why? How do I know this? Well, let's look at the evidence for that, right? So even not recently, most married families tilt neo-traditional. So they are still favoring the traditional nuclear family model of the man earning the money and bringing home the bacon, so to speak, and women receiving the money and spending that money, right? Though a large minority of couples are following an egalitarian model, for the majority of married families with children, family life is organized along neo-traditional lines and has been since the 1990s, with the gender revolution stalled out in married families. It's new in the sense that today's married dads do a lot more childcare and housework than dads in the 1950s, and that most married moms are working in the paid labor force, but it's traditional in the sense that most husbands take the lead when it comes to breadwinning, and most wives take the lead when it comes to child rearing, right? And it also says right here, but most married mothers in the US tilt in a more neo-traditional than egalitarian direction when it comes to their preferences. In fact, more than 3/4 of married mothers do not wish to work full-time. 53% prefer part-time work, and 23% prefer to be stay-at-home mothers. So yeah, as you can see, mothers and women in general are very happily taking on traditional roles because they benefit from it, actually, because they can stay at home, spend time with the kids while the man is the workhorse, right? And they receive the money that the man earns. Okay? So if this was really detrimental to women, why do the women prefer that? Right? Even today. Right? And it also shows you that when we today still have these traditional family structures, right? But we at the same time have these high divorce rates, and the majority of the custody goes to the mothers. It shows you that this model is actually not working, right? So this just destroys the myth that these tradcons hype up about the traditional family. It's actually very unstable, right? So there you have it, Richard Reeves. I've shown you the actual reasons why men and boys are falling behind in the education system. They are actually not falling behind. They are being held back deliberately and viciously, okay? And again, has something to do with teachers' bias against boys and men. This has something to do with misandry, with corporal punishment, with unfair and counterproductive disciplinary measures that boys face. This has something to do with fatherlessness, which feminists have contributed to, right? So this has jack shit to do with brain development, Richard Reeves. Okay? So stop this victim blaming bullshit and actually talk about the real issues. Kick the feminists out of the education system, right? Kick the feminists out of the legal system and make sure that the fathers are not kicked out of the family, actually, right? And have pro-male affirmative action in the education system, right? And work against the discrimination against men and boys in the education system. Misandry and feminism is the main reason why this is going on, and not brain development. Okay? So yeah, this is really all that needs to be said about that. I hope this was educational. Peace out.